Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this online talk from the Contemporary Art Society for Wales. Now, before we get into the talk in normal manner, I have to tell you I'm having some technical difficulties. For some reason, the microphone on my laptop has decided it doesn't want to work. So I'm using Sian's iPad to speak. I've turned off the speakers on my laptop, but I'm using the laptop to run all the systems. So I'm going to say, keep your fingers crossed that we get through it, because I don't actually understand why the microphone didn't work properly. So that's my excuse for when this goes wrong. It's not going to be our speakers. It's not going to be anybody else. It's going to be entirely down to me. Right. This talk is the first of 3 talks being produced in collaboration with Amgueddfa Cymru, National Museum Wales, and I'm delighted to introduce this evening's speaker from the museum, Senior Curator, Modern and Contemporary Art, Neil Lebeter. Good evening, Neil.
Good evening, Roland. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on, and I'm sorry that you're the sufferer of the technical problems. Right. Neil has been Senior Curator, Modern Contemporary Art at Amgueddfa Cymru since 2018. He studied history and then museum and gallery studies in Scotland before taking up the post of Archive Curator at the New Art Gallery, Walsall. And then he joined the University of Edinburgh as Art Collections Curator and Deputy Head of Museums. In his current role, Neil has curated the Rules of Art exhibition that is currently showing at the National Museum in Cardiff. Now, Neil has agreed to take questions at the end of this talk for those joining us on Zoom. We would like you to put your question and your name in the chat box, and when we get to the point for questions, I will explain how this is going to work. So Neil, at this point, it's over to you.
Well, Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much for inviting me this evening. I'm just going to share my screen so you can hopefully see my slides, which should be coming through to you now. Thanks for having me. So what we're going to do this evening is do a bit of a virtual tour of the exhibition. So thankfully, thanks to colleagues at the museum, we have some really nice installation shots of the exhibition. So I'm going to give you a kind of, as much as is possible, a bit of a virtual walkthrough of the show and maybe pick out a few key works that kind of raise some of the themes that we're hoping to kind of get across in the show, and give a bit of an introduction, and then we'll have time for some questions at the end. I'm also going to finish with an exclusive reveal, which I won't say anything more about at this stage. So some breaking news at the end to share with you, which I'm quite excited about. So as Roland mentioned, I've been in post at the museum since 2018. I'm aware that some of you may not know me. That time has been at this exhibition as well has been kind of impacted and delayed by COVID. So I'll talk a little bit about myself and in terms of my background. And I think what kind of comes through in this show is particularly in my previous role at the University of Edinburgh and kind of working with academic collections is an interest in kind of moving or kind of thinking beyond kind of specific mediums or specific specialisms or time periods, and kind of looking across thematically over different subject matters and seeing what kind of stories can be teased out of collections in their kind of broadest sense. And I think hopefully that's something that we've tried to particularly emphasize in this show, is kind of looking beyond the chronological to see what else can be kind of pulled out, what stories can be pulled out of the collection across 5 centuries. So coming to National Museum Wales, the Rules of Art was really the first project that I worked on after joining. And it was a really amazing way to kind of get to know a collection, and by far the biggest art collection that I've ever worked with. The show was originally meant to open in May 2020. And in fact, we had just started clearing the galleries for installation when the first lockdown hit. So the exhibition, which opened in October last year, was a kind of long time coming, and it's gone through various changes as a result, some of which we'll discuss later. Principally, I think that the exhibition is on for a great deal longer than it was originally slated to be on. It's now on for a year and a half, which is allowing us to kind of look at changeovers and kind of refreshing elements of the exhibition, expanding things like our learning work and working with communities to kind of change parts of it, which I'll explain a little bit more at the end. I don't want to say too much. And I think also looking at, you know, an exhibition that was largely curated and kind of largely ready to go just before this really kind of seismic event, this kind of thing that happened to society, I think was a really interesting example of how collections move with the times in which they exist. They're not static. So the associations and kind of interpretations that I think a few key works in the show really bring forth is reflected back in the events that we've all lived through in the last year and a half. So I think that's something that we will come to a little bit later. So moving on. So the Rules of Art is an exhibition that is fundamentally about showing the Amgueddfa Cymru art collection in a new way. And it's about celebrating its strength and breadth, but also showing it within a framework that allows discussion and questions about the collection and the societal and art historical context in which it sits. So the project came out of the art department rethinking the permanent galleries at the museum. And these are conversations that are still ongoing and are really active at the moment. So there is an element of experimentation with this show, and we're kind of looking at different ways in which we can showcase the permanent collection, of which, you know, 95+% of this exhibition is made up of the permanent collection. So, you know, there's elements of this that may work, there's elements of that may not work so well. So we're on a kind of learning journey with this as well. And our audiences are kind of telling us about things that work and things that don't work. So in total, we've kind of pulled together around 80 works from across 500 years of art history and from over a century of the museum's collecting, creating formal and informal connections between historic and contemporary works and works that have never been shown together side by side before. And that's really the kind of main driver of the exhibition, is kind of showing things in a new way and in partnerships that are hopefully will spark something completely different. So to create a thematic framework to kind of for this to work around was definitely the hardest aspect of planning the exhibition. The collection itself is vast, as I'm sure you will know, with over 50,000 works of all mediums. So a thematically driven cross-period exhibition could go in infinite numbers of directions. So actually kind of pinning down what that is was the hardest thing. Finding something that was loose enough to be able to provide a flexibility of framework that we can work within, but also with enough focus so that it has a direction. It's not a kind of just random assortment of things hanging in the gallery. So something that can kind of facilitate conversation and debate. So we looked back at some of the kind of founding principles of Western art as a means of showing the collection in this new way, but also as a way to question the hierarchies within the art world and wider society that influenced what artists created and what museums collected for centuries. So we're talking for hundreds of years. And these systems are in a lot of ways constructions of our own making and constructions that are still being unpicked. So the discussions that are being had inside and outside of the institution are kind of looking at some of those foundational building blocks in which our museum and many other museums in Western Europe in particular have been built upon. And I think perhaps, as Roland mentioned, perhaps not coming from an art background, neither by practice or from studying art history, I think the kind of structures and power dynamics that existed and still exist within the art world are really interesting to me. The influence that academies, patrons, collectors, and then museums have had on art are immense and are still being thought through. So there is an element of holding up a mirror to the museum itself in this process. And the museum is part of those structures. I, as a curator, I'm part of that structure as well. And we're working with external community groups to create things like podcasts. We're doing filmed interviews with artists. So a lot of the voices that are coming in about this show aren't necessarily the kind of institutional voice. So we settled on what is known as the hierarchy of genres. So this was formalized in the 17th century by the French Academy. And then, so that this kind of pooled together academic and artistic thought that had been in existence since the Renaissance, but kind of formalized it. The French Academy was the first kind of organization to academically formalize it. And then this framework was adopted by art academies across Europe. So this literally ranked painting in order of importance, which went on to influence art of all genres for hundreds of years. So I'm going to do my kind of top of the pops countdown thing here in reverse order. So in fifth, in bottom, is still life, followed by landscape, scenes of everyday life, portraits, second top, and then the most important painting, according to the academies, was history painting. So kind of scenes from the Bible, mythology, national triumphs, and so on. So the 5 galleries of the exhibition are set out within that framework, so within those kind of 5 genres, but crucially not in that order. And placing some genres together to make the point about this kind of hierarchical representation of art, which in itself is a hierarchical representation of society. And we'll come to look at portraits and scenes of everyday life later, but those were 2 of the genres that we placed together to make that exact point, which we'll discuss. And I'll move this on. So the show is concluded by John Aconfra's epic 3-screen video installation, Vertigo Sea, which is sort of all of those genres all at once and so much more besides. And it's really important with this piece and the other new acquisitions. There's a kind of really important core group of acquisitions that are in the show to show the continuity that essentially exists from some of the earliest works in the exhibition. And the earliest piece is from the early 1500s. Through to a work that we acquired in 2019. So it's trying to emphasize that continuity of activity, that there is more in common across the centuries and across these periods than there are in difference between historic and contemporary works. And what we hope people will learn from the show or take away from it is that visitors will see some works that are very familiar to them, some of which we'll discuss. The Bard by Thomas Jones, for example, which hasn't been on display in the museum for quite some time, but showing those works in a new way, and hopefully also bridging the gap that can exist between historic and contemporary art, and to break down the architectural division that exists specifically at National Museum Cardiff. So many of you will know the building very well, but in the east wing of the art galleries, you have historic work. In the center block, you have kind of late 19th and early 20th century work. And in the west wing, you have contemporary work. So there's a very kind of split architectural demarcation that can kind of split up and emphasize difference rather than kind of emphasizing similarity. So the exhibition is about opening up those questions to show that, art history doesn't necessarily exist in neat chronological chunks of time, but also for our audience is that a key message is that for our audiences is that those messages are not prescriptive. And this is really, as I mentioned about us rethinking the redisplay of the galleries, it's the start of this conversation. It's not the end of something. So in approaching, yes, having not long joined the museum, kind of approaching something like this and quite showing the collection in a completely different way was quite daunting, and particularly working with a collection of scale and kind of importance, I think, that I'd never worked with before. And landing on this first pairing was really important because it kind of showed me how it could work, and kind of showing kind of clear and something really bold and informal and hopefully kind of refreshing way of showing collections. This was the kind of model pairing from which the rest of the exhibition worked. And not coincidentally, this is the first pairing that visitors see when they enter the exhibition as a kind of an introduction. This is how the exhibition works from here on in. So this is Botticelli's Virgin and Child with a Pomegranate, displayed next to Helen Muspratt's Mother and Child, South Wales. So the Botticelli in studio work, I'm sure a work many of you will be familiar with, well known to our audiences, and also a type of work that is very familiar. You know, we've seen this type of religious imagery in galleries and museums all over the world. This was recently featured in the BBC's Lost Masterpieces programme, where it's had its attribution upgraded, which is great. It's always good when it goes up rather than down. And this is its first showing since that programme, which I think was in 2019. And Helen Muspratt was one of the leading women photographers in Britain in the early 20th century. And in 1937, she travelled to South Wales to record the conditions miners and their families were enduring in the valleys. So there is a kind of deliberate venerating of the working class through this work, and informally using the visual language of religious art to do so. If you look, you can see it just in this image, but if you look closely at the work in the galleries, you can see the poor boy on the left-hand side of the image has been kind of hand torn out of it. So the photographer has noticed this kind of visual association after the fact and hand ripped the print to emphasize this kind of mother and child motif much more strongly. So this acted as a template for the rest of the show. So of pairings, groupings, even whole galleries built thematically and working on a number of levels. So kind of purely visually, some more political, but with no kind of prescribed way to kind of approach this exhibition. If visitors want to just kind of take in a chocolate box of visually stimulating works that are in conversation with each other, that is as valid a way to approach the exhibition as anything else. I'm going to spend more time discussing the contemporary works here. We will discuss some of the historic works on show, but more as a kind of foil for their partner 20th and 21st century works that demonstrate how we've tried to make those links across the centuries. Crucially, CASW is also a really important and big part of this story, and it's very fitting that I'm discussing the exhibition with one of the major supporters of the museum's collection over the decades. A perfect example of this is the fact that two of the works that will be discussed this evening have come into the museum's collection from direct support from CASW and are separated by 61 years. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Contemporary Art Society for Wales, as is in the example of this exhibition and many others like it over the years. It would be a poorer show without your long-standing support. So thank you very much. So we're going to move into, those of you that know the West Wing galleries, we've just come in off the balcony. We've come into gallery 20, which we've set up as we're not calling it history painting because there's more than painting in it, but the kind of history gallery. So art academies in the 17th and 18th centuries considered history painting to be the most important form of art, going on to influence art of all genres for many centuries. This fell out of fashion after the Second World War, particularly when imperialism and national histories became much more contested and questioned. But notions of kind of similarly grand themes and universal questions, of course, still inspire artists very much to this day. Of course, The Bard by Thomas Jones, painted in 1774, is the most well-known history painting in the story of art in Wales. recounting Edward I's fabled massacre of the Welsh bards in the 13th century. The massacre was seen as a symbolic act, an attempt to silence and suppress the very heart of Welsh culture. Rather than becoming victim to the English army, the last bard of Wales hurls himself off the cliffs of Snowdonia and places a curse on the king's followers. The work is an iconic history painting in the story of art here. It has also been used to construct and to challenge notions of national identity and has a reading of a message of language, memory, and cultural loss. It is paired in the gallery next to Rachel Whiteread's Untitled History. And just kind of looking back to that first installation shot we had, so this is just over the other side of the door to the Botticelli and the Helen Muspratt, which is a really direct kind of visual conversation going on. And I thought it was important to have something more abstract and more kind of open to show the kind of two ends of how we're approaching the show, but also to bring out something to encourage kind of conversation around those works rather than trying to kind of pin things down a bit too exactly. So this is Rachel Whiteread's Untitled History from 2002. Whiteread's work has been described as minimalism with a heart. Her work tends to cast the negative space around objects, often those with intense personal associations. So a mattress, here books and chairs, furniture, so on, even a house, which was our Turner Prize winning work in the early 90s. Her sculptures have a haunting quality that's often hard to pin down, as is very much the case with this work. So Untitled History is a sculpture made of plaster, polystyrene, and steel. This work was made by casting the space around a set of bookshelves, leaving an empty space where the books once were. If you look closely at the sculpture, and as you can see from this image, colours from the spines and fragments of the covers of the books have left an imprint. So when they were removed or the kind of casting process was taken out, then parts of the books stuck to it. So these kind of ghostly traces set starkly against the white of the plaster, and there's really kind of interesting flecks of colour that go through it, and texture as well. There's even the kind of texture of material coming through. So Whiteread has created a series of these sculptures that act as a form of memorial. The absence of the books in this work is unsettling in a way that is hard to describe exactly. We just know there's something not right here, that this kind of, this literature is absent somewhere. So if language and culture are the foundation of our shared heritage, perhaps Untitled History, in the same way that the Bard does, hints at how easily collective memory can be lost. Moving into Gallery 19, which is the Derek Williams Gallery, for those of you that know it. So unfortunately, if you were a still life artist working in the 18th century, you would be producing the lowest form of painting according to the art academies. Today, however, as we will see from an important CASW funded new acquisition, still life continues to thrive as an inspiration for artists and for audiences. Though in existence before the 17th century, the genre came into prominence in the 1600s in the Dutch Republic. Paintings of lavish bouquets of flowers, food, and other commodities from around the world spoke to the Republic's growing wealth, trade, and global domination. Put simply, a lavish bouquet of flowers with flowers from all over the world can only exist in the 17th century with a kind of complex and imperial network of trade. So the whole gallery in 19 is devoted to the genre. So it's a larger group rather than having kind of specific pairings. It's kind of celebrating still life in, again, across 2-3 centuries of work. However, a few works that push the definition of what still life can be and more kind of looking at stillness and meditation, something particularly relevant in these times of lockdown and isolation, is a really interesting group of works to consider. And this was the gallery that seemed to resonate the most following lockdowns and the upheaval of the pandemic. There's two works, which, apologies, I don't have a slide of, which I'm sure many of you will know, Gwen John's A Corner of the Artist's Room in Paris, and Anthony Chaplin's really beautiful film, A Setting, were originally put into the exhibition to kind of look at more kind of meditative and, well, they are kind of meditative works. But I think those two pieces in particular were really interesting when thinking about, you know, loneliness and isolation and things that perhaps, you know, I didn't think about and colleagues didn't think about when we were first thinking about this show, and letting those works kind of speak to people in those ways, I think is a really important part of this. And as I said at the start of the talk, how those collections kind of move through time, and we kind of see things differently as the world around us changes. I think a pairing that works particularly well in this space and has been, we've had really great feedback from audiences about, is Paul Cézanne and Zoe Priest. I'll bring up a slight close up. Here we go. So Cézanne, a very well-known work in the collection and one of the iconic paintings of the Davies sisters' bequest. Paul Cézanne transformed the use and status of still life painting, how it could go beyond literal representation to explore colour, form and abstraction. He painted still lives throughout his career, but the greatest of these are arguably from his final years, and this would have been one of his one of his last still lives before his death in 1906. So the tablecloth and the objects on the table resemble more a landscape than they do a still life. Perspective has been manipulated and details are secondary to the harmony of the overall composition. Cézanne himself wrote, quote, "Painting from nature is not copying the object, it is realizing one's own sensations," which links very nicely to Zoe Priest. Priest has said of her work that it is about, quote, "paying homage to an ordinary moment." And that comes through really strongly in this work. So here we have the aftermath of a dinner rendered permanent and everlasting in porcelain. Priest celebrates the everyday and the domestic as the site of inspiration. Material presence is a work that slows everything down and looks at the kind of very small things of life that make up all of our existences and are often kind of overlooked. And with this work, Priest won the 2018 Eisteddfod Gold Medal for Craft and Design. And with the support of CASW, the museum was able to acquire the work as part of the National Eisteddfod Purchase Prize. So this is one of the really key new acquisitions by a Welsh artist in the show, and also kind of adding to a group of Eisteddfod winners, which is a really important part of that kind of ongoing development of the art collection. What's been really nice about the exhibition in general, but specifically about this work, was talking to Zoe about it. And she said something that I cannot believe I didn't notice when we were thinking about the exhibition. And she said that teapot in the Cézanne looks like it's been lifted off the table of my work and just kind of placed into the painting, which is just adds like a really lovely dynamic to that partnership and just makes that richer. And yeah, and talking to people about the show, there's kind of lots of things like that that are kind of coming up that people are finding themselves. So moving into portraits. So we're in gallery 21 now, with the columns. So to the right, you can just see so each of the galleries tends to have a kind of the Academy definition of what the kind of genre work is. So in this one, we have Joshua Reynolds' portrait of Major Catchmaid Morgan. Major General Catchmaid Morgan, I think is the title. So a very typical portrait by the Academy definition. And elsewhere in the gallery, you have portraits that are really kind of pushing what portraiture was, you know, looking at the Rembrandt from the 17th century, a lone female sitter in a 17th century portrait was incredibly unusual. The Francis Bacon completely deconstructing what a portrait, or in this case, what a self-portrait is and what it actually says about its sitter. So another work which is just next to the Bacon, which I'd like to discuss, is Donald Rodney's in the House of My Father from 1996-97. And while the artist may not have intended specifically for this to be a self-portrait, it is nonetheless an extraordinary example of a contemporary self-portrait. So a photograph shows the artist's hand resting on the white sheet of a hospital bed. In his palm sits a small sculpture of a house made from his own skin. The skin was removed during treatment for sickle cell anemia, an inherited genetic condition that led to Rodney's death in 1998 at the age of 36. The house sculpture is a partner work to In the House of My Father, titled My Mother, My Father, My Sister, My Brother, with the two works sitting side by side in the exhibition. So we are the only collection. There are other editions of the photograph that exist in other collections, but we're the only collection that are able to show these works side by side, thanks to the estate of Donald Rodney loaning the work to the museum for, I think, over 2 decades now. Sorry, let's get back. So Rodney's later work focused on his own mortality, along with the sense of family and identity. As a British-born artist whose parents had emigrated from Jamaica, Rodney explored shifting notions of Britishness and the experience of the Afro-Caribbean diaspora. An incredibly moving work and a moving self-portrait. The work retains an ambiguous power and carries profound messages around inherited experience. Next is Bob and Roberta Smith's David Knott interview. I'm going to zoom in progressively. This is a work that doesn't photograph particularly well because the text on it is so small. I would emphasize seeing this work is very important to kind of fully appreciate it. So Bob and Roberta Smith is an artist who's predominantly known for his sign writing, for kind of brightly coloured protest signs. So a work that's in the collection of the Tate, titled Make Art Not War, is one of his most iconic works. He trained as a sign writer. It's kind of very familiar type of work from hand painted signs, but very colourful, playful. He's a really strong advocate for arts education in schools and does a lot of his work about the importance of art in the curriculum, which in England in particular is something of great concern to him. This work, however, is not brightly coloured. It's not typical in terms of his practice, but is one of the first of these long form text pieces that the artist produced about a very specific topic. And there's been letters to politicians that have been similarly constructed. But this work is a transcription of an interview that the Welsh consultant surgeon, Professor David Knott, gave it was either New Year's Day 2014 or in between Christmas and New Year 2013 on the PM programme on Radio 4 with Eddie Mair. So David Knott is an absolutely extraordinary character, and I would really recommend his autobiography for anyone that wants to learn more about him. He is a surgeon working in London. He's from Wales. He was born and brought up in Wales, and he volunteers 2-3 months of his time each year, and volunteers for organisations such as Médecins Sans Frontières, the Red Cross, Syria Relief, whoever needs help, essentially. And he travels to these war zones, operates on injured civilians, and also trains local surgeons. So the kind of provision, the medical provision is greater for him being there. He has, I could talk about David Knott for a long time, but yeah, I would recommend his autobiography. The interview, which I'm sure many of you will have heard, is a really famous broadcast. And I remember listening to it live, and it is incredibly powerful and moving. And David had just returned from Syria after, I think it was his second stint working for Syria Relief. And for someone who had been in war zones since the early 90s, it was by far, by his own admission, the worst and most shocking experience that he had ever had in a war zone. He had not long come back and gave this extraordinary interview to Eddie Knott, which the artist has transcribed in full So this work is just under 5 meters in height, and is uncomfortable and is a shocking read. There's a really amazing moment in the center of the work, which was reflected in the broadcast itself, where David Knott was describing the operating theatre in the field hospital where he was working, and he was using the language of the abattoir because it was so drastic, the kind of situation that he was in. Eddie Mair was either kind of stunned into silence or was too emotional to ask the next question. And there was this really moving and incredible moment on radio where there was 15 to 20 seconds of dead air. There was complete silence. And then Eddie asks, every day? David replies, every day, every single day was the same. And more silence. And that's kind of this island in the middle of this block of somber black and white text that exists in the work. So the work, in terms of its scale, the scale of its message, the kind of really searing anti-war message that David Knott is putting across in this work, and also his kind of charitable work more generally, cannot be avoided in the gallery because of the scale of the work. It's an uncompromising piece. We have an event, and in conversation with David Knott, Bob and Roberta Smith, and the journalist Wire Davies, on the 31st of March. So if this is something you're interested in, then please keep an eye on the museum's website, because tickets are going to be released for that very soon. Just aware of time slightly. I think we're doing okay. So Scenes of Everyday Life is in the same gallery as portraiture. And I kind of alluded to this earlier in terms of placing some of these genres together in order to show the impact that the hierarchy that was introduced by the academies had in terms of the representation of society. So portraiture, so in particular in contrast to the Joshua Reynolds, and we're often kind of looking at the academy example as a kind of springboard to kind of have conversations about. So looking at the Reynolds in particular, with portraiture and Scenes of Everyday Life, the kind of marked differences that existed in the representation of society through the hierarchy, so of both class and gender. So with class, you have the rich and powerful depicted through kind of high portraiture. Scenes of Everyday Life is the general public. So there you have a kind of value judgment in terms of underpinning kind of social underpinning the class system. So both class and also gender. So portraiture, overwhelmingly 19th century portraiture of rich, powerful men, and the higher form of art in the eye of the academies. And this kind of particular avenue of scenes of everyday life of women in domestic settings, performing stereotypical gender roles within the home, are a common theme. Scenes of everyday life is quite broad, but we've concentrated on this, this particular avenue. So in this section, we're asking audiences to question the female subject from the male and female perspective. So kind of looking at the male gaze and the female gaze, and ask our audiences what the differences between those two things might be. So looking at Harold Gilman's The Kitchen from circa 1908, and this is our CASW gift from 1957, so one of the earliest gifts in the exhibition from the late 50s. So a recurring theme that characterises the art of the Camden Town Group is that of women in the domestic interior, most evident in paintings by Walter Sickert, here with Harold Gilman, Spencer Gore, Malcolm Drummond and William Radcliffe, among others. In Gilman's painting, a lone figure is shown within the domestic space of the kitchen. As the title suggests, Gilman has positioned the figure as indistinguishable from the kitchen and its role within the home. So Gilman is a really good example of multiple narratives kind of existing in parallel. So he and the wider Camden Town Group are hugely important in shaping modern art in Britain in the first part of the 20th century. He was part of the Allied Artists Association, a progressive affiliation of artists that was set up to promote modernism and create an exhibiting organisation outside of the confines of the Royal Academy, much in the same way as the Impressionists did in the late 19th century in Paris. However, the irony of much of the Camden Town group paintings is that although women in the domestic sphere feature prominently as a subject matter, women artists were expressly denied membership of their group. Moving to 2019 and Caroline Walker's Conditioning. So this is another of the new acquisitions, which is on show in the exhibition for the first time. So Walker is a Scottish artist. Her work is full of art historical references and points to the Impressionists in particular as an inspiration. So this is why the work has come into the museum's collection, because of the conversations that can happen between those two, the contemporary and historic parts of the collection. However, crucially, this is about subverting that male gaze that exists in much of the work looking back to Gilman and others, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And throughout her work, Walker is drawing attention to the hidden labour of cities, service industry workers that are in some areas overwhelmingly occupied by women and little attention paid to by wider society. In this series, Walker conducted walks through the city at night, in this case London, photographing these scenes and working them to create sketches, oil sketches, and then finally paintings. She's currently in the British Art Show that's touring the UK at the moment. Moving to landscape, excuse me. Lastly, landscape. So this is a gallery that's rooted in Welsh work. This is all work either created in Wales or work by Welsh artists. Because the story of landscape painting in Wales is so important, and the richness of our collection to that story is really unique. So we've kind of concentrated on entirely Welsh work here. So as landscape paintings did not contain the human form as a primary subject, art academies originally considered it as one of the lowest forms of art. Painting nature for nature's sake was seen prior to the Celtic revival as pointless. Yet, as we know, it remains a vibrant genre today, particularly in Wales. The richness of the story here opens up important debates around identity and place. Contemporary landscapes can also explore the extremes of the use and representation of our environment. Painting the landscape and the appreciation of nature for its own sake was pioneered here in the 18th century. A revived literary and artistic interest in the Celtic past also drew artists into Wales. Groundbreaking work by Welsh artists like Richard Wilson and the subsequent discovery, in inverted commas, of the landscape by artists outside of Wales made the country a haven for artists, as it very much remains so to this day. In the second half of the 20th century, artists began to use a variety of different techniques and materials, continuing this same tradition whilst drawing attention to the issues around climate change and the exploitation of the environment. And in doing so, we've been able to show these two works side by side for the first time. So Richard Wilson's iconic view of Cadair Idris, dating from 1764-65. This is on loan from Mostyn Hall, who kindly loaned the painting to us, alongside Bedwyr Williams' film Tir which uses Williams' view as inspiration, as a kind of starting point. This work was awarded the Derek Williams Trust Artis Mundi Purchase Prize in 2016, and is its first showing since Artis Mundi of that year. So we're able to kind of almost bookend the kind of beginning of those 18th century landscape traditions in Wales, and then taking it to almost like a Black Mirror-like future that Williams is doing through this film. So Tir is a kind of moving image work that is a kind of moving painting, if it can be described that way. It's imagining that same view around Lyn Cow on Cadair Idris, but with a futuristic mega city on the banks of the lake. And a narrator tells the story of the formation of this new city some of the teething problems that it's had, and in terms of its culture and its history kind of springing from nothing. So there's a criticism of the city for not really having a song old enough, for example, for it to be considered a proper city. And like a lot of Bedwyr Williams' work, it is very funny. It is really dry, but also deadly serious, and kind of looking at issues around land management and urban development more generally and globally. So looking at places like in the United Arab Emirates, where cities appear as if from nowhere, entirely new urban developments, and looking at the issues and some of the kind of questions that can come out of that. So that, moving on from kind of Bedwyr's work and kind of thinking about the non-idealized landscape and emphasizing contemporary work within Wales and its importance, we've kind of looked mainly at contemporary work and also at things that slightly frustrate and slightly kind of don't necessarily play by the rules of landscape painting. Two very quick examples of these: Helen Sear's Blocked Field, which is a large photographic work of hay bales that are literally blocking the iconic view of Raglan Castle. So looking to kind of question the nature of landscape and its representation. Similarly, James Riley's Partially Buried, which is a kind of response to the Aberfan disaster. Riley grew up in Wales in the 1960s and 70s and was part of a generation of children that really kind of grew up in the shadow of Aberfan, and this being this really kind of bleak story within Wales that was being dealt with by children of his age, and produced this kind of really moving, childlike construction of this house being engulfed by this immovable black pyramid, and kind of thinking about the effect on the landscape and our relationship to it, and the kind of exploitation of the landscape and its effect. I'm speeding up slightly now. I'm going over. So in conclusion, in last few minutes, so in conclusion, we have John Aconfra's Vertigo Sea. So this is a new acquisition, and this is its premiere in Wales, the first time it's been shown in Wales, having first been shown at the Venice Biennale in 2015. It is a huge 3-screen video installation that explores the beauty of nature and the destruction wrought by humans to the environment and to ourselves. Vertigo Sea embodies the notion of the sublime, the feeling of beauty, awe, and terror inspired by the natural world, which has fascinated artists for hundreds of years. Aconfra is well known to the museum, having been the winner of Artist Mundi 7 with his film Auto de Fe. It is a testament to the museum supporters that we've been able to co-acquire a work of this significance in partnership with Towner Art Gallery in Eastbourne. The work draws on a wide range of visual and literary sources, incorporating new footage and the BBC Natural History Archive. Vast in scope and presentation, Aconfra explores a broad sweep of human history. The whaling industry, the current refugee crisis, and the transatlantic slave trade are major themes. Peppered throughout the film is the personal narrative of Aluda Equiano, a former slave and abolitionist, along with Herman Melville's Moby Dick from 1851 and Heathcote Williams' epic poem Whale Nation from 1988. The work is hypnotic and overwhelming, filling your field of vision along with full surround sound. The film completely envelops you, which is what makes the truly shocking moments of the film of human and animal suffering so affecting. A colleague at the museum referred to the work as devastating, which I think is as close as it's possible to say in kind of brief summation. And I think it is a work that needs to be seen to be fully appreciated. The final work in the show, which is seen as you exit this video space and is the kind of full stop to the exhibition and a final link across the centuries. This time thinking about how the sublime and the artist's notion of capturing the beauty and terror of the sea has been a common theme dating back centuries. And a review of the exhibition referred to the hanging of and its positioning of this work as stomach churning, which was the point. and yeah, within the context of the show is kind of asking people to think different, or kind of look at this work differently, having just seen Vertigo Sea. And finally, to finish, my exclusive, which I promised you at the beginning. So as part of the exhibition, and the exhibition's running on for 18 months, we're taking the opportunity to change elements of it. And the gallery that Vertigo Sea is currently installed in is going to be changed later this year. And it's going to be a co-curated display with our Demystifying Acquisitions group that I've been working with since May of last year on a new acquisition, and on displaying that new acquisition as part of a co-curated display, which will bring in more elements of the collection. This work, which I can now reveal for the first time, that was decided by the Demystifying Acquisitions group. So for the first time in the museum's history, an acquisition has gone forward with a decision not by the curatorial department. So we're kind of democratizing looking at acquisitions so that young people can learn about the process, but also input into our processes. Chris Ofili's North Wales series, which is a series of etchings from 1996, which were created within an hour's travelling distance of Lebeter in Gwynedd, and are kind of psychogeographic responses to North Wales. So carrying on that tradition of artists coming to North Wales to make work. And a quote to finish from Ofili, who described the process of his landscape etchings as, quote, "a very nourishing way of working. It can take me to places within myself which are unfamiliar, and that can feed into the painting. It's like deep sea diving. You pick up something and then go back to the surface with it, rather than having a pre-designed image, which you then go and make. It's about having a vague idea, going somewhere, looking and responding. And it's a way of looking at a place through my eyes." So I'll be working with the Demystifying Acquisitions group to hang this new acquisition, and they are thinking currently about new pieces to kind of relaunch the rules of art and broaden again the voices that are being kind of heard through this exhibition. I'll finish there because I've gone on, but thank you for your patience and for listening. Diolch yn fawr.
Right, Neil, if we're going to stop the share screen at this point.
Yes. Excuse me. Okay.
Great. Now then, everybody, time for questions. Can you move on to speaker view? And you will now find that you're allowed to unmute yourselves. Well, I'd like you to stay muted until I ask you to put your question. And then can you mute yourselves after you've been through the question, so before the next person comes on? Otherwise, we could end up with an awful lot of questions over each other. I've got Peter Jenkins, who wanted to ask, I think, a very interesting question early on in the presentation. So, Peter, do you like to put your question to Neil?
You referred to inheriting experiences, which on the face of it seems to be counterproductive, as experiences are social or environmental factors. And I think what you mean is interpreting experiences historically, but perhaps you could clarify that.
Yeah, I think the work I was meaning specifically around inherited experience was the Donald Rodney. So I think specifically, I know the point, I know what you mean, but I think specifically with that work, it's looking at, so for example, that sickle cell anemia is an inherited condition through the father's line. So it's kind of inherited experience in terms of that, you know, that physical condition, but also looking at the inherited experience of, you know, second generation immigrant into the United Kingdom and what that means. And yeah, if that makes sense. Sorry, I didn't make that clear first time round.
Right. At the moment, I haven't got any more questions in the chat room, but I've had one passed over my shoulder, so I'll hand that phone across.
Okay. Hi, Neil. Thanks so much for that. I was particularly interested in the Richard Wilson Bedwyr Williams combination. Obviously, those of us who are familiar with Tyrau Mawr will remember it as a vast, enormous video at the Artis Mundi exhibition. It has obviously been reduced considerably for your exhibition. How difficult was it to negotiate that reduction with Bedwyr Williams?
He was really supportive of it, actually, and I think it was specifically because it was going to be shown alongside the painting. And I think if it hadn't been shown alongside the painting, I think those would have been, understandably, that would have been a harder sell, because, as you say, the work is kind of is supposed to be kind of monumental in scale. And I think one of the concerns that I had is, if we were going to show it at that scale, then how would the relationship with the Wilson work if it was shown kind of at its original size? So I think Bedwyr was really supportive of, they're not exactly the same size in terms of screen, it's still quite a sizable screen that it's on. Yeah, so it was the bridge between the two things that kind of allowed us to change the way that it's shown so much, I think.
Good, thank you.
Right, I've got a question here from Katie Fisman. Katie, would you like to put your question?
Yeah, hi Neil, thank you. Yeah, I'm so glad I get to ask this, because I went to the exhibition and which was lovely, and it was amazing to have those rooms open again after so long. And I read the information at the beginning and learnt about the hierarchies of the genres, which I didn't know anything about. And I immediately assumed that when I went through, there would be like a mixing of genres. And so I was surprised, and I wanted to ask, I was like, oh, why? How did you ever consider to mix them up more, or why not? Or yeah, that was the question.
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that kind of comes back to that. I think thing saying in the introduction about that difficulty of choosing the route in which to go down, because yeah, as you suggest, that is equally as kind of a valid a way to kind of pursue the framework and kind of really subvert it and kind of shake it up in that way. Yeah, I don't know if I necessarily have an answer for that, other than to say that, yeah, that's a good idea as well. But I think one of the things that I think the benefit of kind of showing it within that framework, and I think one of the concerns I had was getting kind of too hung up on the genres and maybe trying to define things as with it sitting within a genre where the artist didn't necessarily think of them in that way. So trying not to kind of define it too specifically. But to use the kind of genre groupings as a springboard in order to kind of, so things kind of hang together within a group that hopefully is kind of visually striking, but also to allow a kind of simplicity of narrative, I suppose, that can kind of break off in different directions. But, you know, those kind of other methods of display, I'm sure would have worked equally well.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think how it was really effective, because even first of all, you've highlighted the genres anyway, and that for me personally was a whole new thing, and it's made me look at the art history in a different way. But then within those genres, you already broke boundaries and things anyway, so it's not like, do you know what I mean? Yeah, it was more subtle. It was more subtle. But I did wonder, maybe I could just ask you last thing quickly, did you purposely put the landscape, which, you know, traditionally were sort of low down on the pecking order, but they were like upstairs above? Did you do that on purpose at all to kind of?
No, but I know what you mean about that kind of, that kind of the traditional setting out of galleries was in that way. But no, I think one of the reasons that it was in the space that it was in was that I was keen for it to link to Vertigo Sea. So the way that it kind of moves through is that you have Brenda Chamberlain and other kind of more seascape type artists as you kind of move towards the end of Gallery 22. So I was keen to make that link between the landscape and the seascape so that it wasn't such a kind of jarring thing if you were moving through, you know, still life and then into Vertigo Sea. So it was more for that reason.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Wendy Shaw, you were asking a question.
Yes, thank you. Just a brief one. I haven't had a chance to come yet. I'm in Mid Wales in Aberystwyth and I work at the School of Art. But I also visit the town in Eastbourne quite a lot because I have family there. So I was just wondering if Neil could tell us a little bit more about the partnership and how that came about with Vertigo Sea, because the film looks incredible and I hope I get a chance to come and see it long before it all finishes.
Sure, yeah. Just to reassure you, Vertigo Sea is going to be on until probably the summer, so it's going to be on for a good while. Yeah, but this is a kind of a really interesting model for acquisitions, which I think we'll probably see more and more of, where we share that work equally. So between Amgueddfa Cymru and Towner and Eastbourne. So we share resources in terms of its actual acquisition. So we raised the money together and kind of contributed from core budgets, but also went to the Art Fund and things in partnership, which funders like the Art Fund really like. So organizations working together to be able to pool resources. Essentially, it allows for things to go much further, and it allows for works, particularly of that kind of significance that may be out of reach financially if it was being pursued individually, to kind of come into the reach of organizations. So practically, we share equipment as well. So there are some elements of the equipment that are stored with us and some that's stored in Eastbourne. So it's less of a kind of physical footprint as well within stores, which is really helpful, but also sharing expertise. So when the work was shown first at Towner, so our AV technician was down there when it was being installed. So we're kind of learning about the work together. We're kind of creating iterative installation documents together at the same time. I think organizations will increasingly work together in this way to kind of share acquisitions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that one. Our president, Peter Wakeling, has a question he'd like to ask. Peter?
Thank you, Roland, and thank you, Neil. I thought you delivered that beautifully. It was very engaging and had a warmth to it, which I'm sure everybody will have appreciated. I've got two questions. I'll ask one of them and then see if other people want to get in before I ask the other one. One of them is about curating and one of them is about art history. And the one about curating is to ask whether you found that there were real problems when you tried to put things together, to hang things together that you felt might work together until you got them into the space. I remember about 25 years ago, I think it was, that Tate Britain rehung the whole place thematic, and there were a lot of complaints that it wasn't doing any of the work any favors. You know, a lot of the works were actually hurt by their something else.
Yeah, really good question. And yeah, short answer, yes. I think that when there were some works in particular that I was really worried about, so the Rembrandt being one of them. So the Rembrandt is kind of, actually the canvas is kind of relatively modest, but the frame is just huge. So I was worried about works like that kind of coming into the white cube and how that would look, and whether that would, as you say, with kind of previous attempts at things like that, and whether that would negatively impact on the work itself, which I don't think it did. I think that for individual works like that, I hope anyway that most of those worked quite well. I think something that definitely happened when we brought things into the space is there were 3 or 4 works that were cut because we found that space filled up. You can kind of measure things out and have things kind of out on diagram and things as much as possible. But there were two relatively substantial in terms of size works that were slated to be on that it just wouldn't have worked. Things suddenly became really cramped and on really substantial walls as well. So where the Maximilian Lentz is, where you come into Gallery 20, that was originally meant to have another work next to it, which seeing that work now is just ludicrous, thinking that anything else could kind of hang alongside it. So yeah, that was a really interesting part of the process of bringing those works in and then kind of working with colleagues. And it was really great working with the art technicians in terms of trying things out. And that's the first time that I've hung anything in those spaces as well. So it was a pretty steep learning curve for me. So I was kind of relying on the expertise of and experience of colleagues in terms of what works in particular places. So yeah, definitely. It was a really interesting part of it though. I think I particularly with things being broken up by lockdown, actually seeing stuff in the galleries after a year and a half was really great. But yeah, there's less work in there than was originally scheduled.
It struck me that you'd got a lot of space there, and that makes a big difference to them.
Yeah,
work against each other, that you can let them breathe.
Yeah.
Well, Peter, nobody else has come in with a question, so I'm very happy for you to have the final question as our president in your question number 2.
Okay, well, I'll make it brief in case somebody else is about to come in. It was a question really about the impact that the hierarchy has had on artists over the years. I guess most modern and contemporary artists have felt able, to worried by being categorized or having their work categorized according to that hierarchy. But I can think of examples of artists who I think have either been pushed to better work by feeling that they wanted to jump from one position to another in the hierarchy, or have actually, I think, been damaged by it. And funnily enough, you showed Thomas Jones's Bard, which is quite rare in his oeuvre as a history painting rather than a landscape painting. And I know he considered it to be his most important painting and his best painting. I think it's probably one of the hardest of his paintings to look at. I find it very difficult. And I'm a big fan of his other work. It's an example where I think somebody's fighting against their personality because they've been persuaded that that's what they ought to do. I just wondered if you'd come across examples of that.
Oh, I'm trying to think. I think I agree with you, Thomas Jones, actually, and just in terms of when I was getting to know the collection, and I think the story around that work and its kind of aura almost is the thing that makes it so important. But when I was getting to know the collection, I was absolutely blown away by his oil sketches in Italy. Like, they're out of this world, like ahead of their time. So I was much more drawn to those type of works when I was kind of getting to know it. But yeah, I'm slightly stumped in terms of thinking more generally along those lines, to be honest. But yeah, I think you're right. And I think that, yeah, as I was kind of saying earlier, I think you rightly say that most modern contemporary artists aren't thinking about the hierarchy of genres in that same way, and quite rightly. And yeah, I think trying to not, hopefully anyway, that the exhibition is kind of open enough so that framework is clear as a kind of springboard to kind of show the collection in a slightly different way, but not like trying to reintroduce it or anything like that, to kind of re-pigeonhole things within that hierarchy is, yeah, what I would definitely like to avoid.
Thank you very much, Neil, for that. I confess that my favourite part of the show is the still life gallery and seeing the Zoe Priest with the Cézanne. I was blown away when I saw that the first time. Right, in a moment, I'm going to invite everybody to say thank you to Neil, but before my technology completely fails, which I'm sure is going to happen shortly, can I just say that if anybody would like to know more about CASW and these events, please visit our website, casw.org.uk. And may I also say that our next talk in this series with Amgueddfa Cymru is on the 22nd of February, when our speakers will be Melanie Pelledri and Caris Tudor, who will be talking about the National Collection of Art as a digital experience. And I think I'm going to need some help on the digital experience after the events of today. But having got through that, and with my final apology, if everybody would like to switch to gallery view, clap, cheer, hiss poo. No, we don't do hiss pooing in CASW. We're far too thing. And give Neil a traditional thank you for what's been a fantastic speech. And again, my apologies for the problems.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.